Hi, everyone. Welcome. We are now officially at the top of the hour, so we are going to get started here today. We are thrilled to see so many people joining what promises to be an insightful and informative webinar. My name is Ayla Anzalotti, and I lead communications for Urban Shift and for WRI's urban development work. Next slide, please. The discussion today is co-led by WRI Ross Center for Sustainable Cities, the UN Environment Program, and the UNEP-led Cool Coalition, and Urban Shift, which is a global environment facility supported partnership between WRI, C40, ICLE, and UNEP. Next slide, please. As you can see on the screen today, we have a packed agenda, which is fitting given what we are here to discuss. You likely don't need me to tell you this, but urban heat is an urgent and mounting threat. If you are in the midst of global summer, if you are in the midst of summer in the global north this year, like many of us on this call are, you'll have felt this intimately. But heat isn't just a personal hindrance, it's a systemic issue. It's sowing widespread health impacts in communities and threatening to fundamentally alter our economic productivity, the way we move around our cities, and the way we connect with one another. It's a challenge that we as people have contributed to, but as you'll hear today, it's also one that we have the power to address. Before I turn the conversation over to our incredible lineup of speakers, I want to go through a few housekeeping items for you all. So next slide, please. We are excited to be able to offer this webinar with interpretation in 3 languages, English, Spanish, and Portuguese. To avail of the interpretation function, please find the globe icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen and select your preferred language. Note that if you're not seeing that globe icon, you might need to click on More, which is indicated by the 3 dots, and then you'll find it in the drop-down menu. If you have any technical issues, please reach out to me in the chat, and I will try my best to help. Next slide, please. Because our agenda is so tight, we are encouraging people to ask questions in real time using the Q&A function. That will also show up for you on the bottom bar of your Zoom screen. And again, it could be hidden in More if you're not seeing it immediately. Our team will do our best to respond to your questions as we move through the event, or you can feel free to leave your email address if you'd like more in-depth follow-up after. Next slide, please. So to kick things off, I would like to turn it over to my colleague Gulnara Roll, the head of UNEP Cities program. Thank you so much, Gulnara.
Thank you so much, Ailey. And I would like to use this opportunity to thank the World Resource Institute for leading organization of this webinar on extreme heat, which is like indeed an extremely important topic. I'm also physically right now in global north, actually in the north of the global north. And I see here, I'm in Estonia, that extreme heat, even here, a big issue. And also we have so many people from the southern part of Europe, more the tourists, but really you see more and more people escaping the extreme heat, going to places like Northern Europe, for instance. So it's just kind of a personal observation. But indeed, Ali, as you mentioned, that this summer here in the global north continues to be very hot all over the region. And also to remind that this summer and June of this year marks the 13th consecutive months of record-breaking temperatures globally. And across the world, we witness unbearable heat waves with temperatures going beyond 50 degrees centigrade in many regions. And we see the devastating impacts, the health crisis, disrupted food systems, forest fires, strained critical infrastructure in many regions. They actually affect the most vulnerable, thermal comfort, health, and in many countries also the actual life of people. And this is why this webinar is really very important for us to share the experiences, to discuss best practices, and to look at the cities who are in forefront of addressing these issues, and actually also brings this to many, many other cities. And we see that we have a quite wide participation today in webinar. So it's very important for us to share these best practices in order to bring these practices on ground to many more cities and human settlements to address the life and health issues of many, many people, especially vulnerable. At the United Nations, this issue is very much recognized, and it's not an accident that the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, issued just a few weeks ago a global call to action on extreme heat. And I would like to cite that he highlighted that extreme heat amplifies inequality, inflames food insecurities, and pushes people further into poverty. We must respond by massively increasing access to low carbon cooling, expanding passive cooling, such as natural based solutions, urban design, and cleaning up cooling technologies while boosting their efficiency. This call to action on extreme heat actually was developed by the team of the Secretary General with 10 other UN agencies, including actually UNEP, UNESCO, UN Habitat, World Health Organization, and many others. And this is the first of the kind of joint product, which highlights the importance of this comprehensive intersectoral approach. And this is why UN agencies from different qualifications join development of the call, of the report and the call. So we need to act together, work together with the governments, international organizations, but also local communities in order to address these very important issues. But I would like to note that so far our response has been largely inadequate. Just one example is that over 2 billion people are still purchasing poor quality air conditioners and refrigerators. Air conditioners are a double burden as it comes to climate change. They use first hydrofluorocarbons, which are organic compounds contributing to global warming. At the same time, they're using significant amount of energy. And just to remind you that global cooling takes 20% of the global energy. So this is really very important topic to address. Also, we're still using building materials to build our homes, which may be cheaper, but not improving heat resilience. We still plan our cities very often the way that we don't consider extreme heat. And this is a vicious cycle. The hotter our cities become, the more we rely on conventional cooling, more emissions we release. And this heats up the planet faster. The hotter planet it is, the more energy we use to cool ourselves. So this is really the downward spiral, which is continuing. And this is really, we need to work together to address this. And look for innovative solutions and look at the comprehensive solutions. The global call to action, which I already mentioned, outlined a triple strategy to address urban heat through, first of all, passive cooling, secondly, improved energy efficiency on buildings, and third, phase out of the climate warming gases used in the cooling equipment. What UN agencies are doing to support this triple strategy to address extreme heat? Last year in December, at the Global Climate Change Conference, the Global Cooling Pledge was launched by the co-presidency and UNEP-led Cool Coalition. The Global Cooling Pledge was endorsed by 71 member states, 16 non-state actors, and several cities. The Global Cooling Pledge aims to raise ambition and international cooperation through collective global targets to reduce cooling-related emissions by 68% from today to 2050, drawing on the modeling from the 2023 UNEP's Global Cooling Watch report. Colleagues, the opportunity in front of us is huge. If we implement this triple strategy outlined in the SG call to action, we can protect almost 3.5 billion of people from extreme heat. And we can save 78 billion of tons of greenhouse emissions by 2050. So it's a lot if we work all together. UNEP and UNEP-led Cool Coalition worked to facilitate implementation of the global cooling pledge by supporting efforts of pledge signatories, both national and subnational governments, to implement their cooling action plans. We are providing technical assistance on passive cooling under the Be Cool program, supported by the governments of Switzerland, Denmark, and Climate Works Foundation. It supports quite many countries, including India, Vietnam, Cambodia, Ghana, Morocco, and Brazil. We're also developing quite many tools and guidelines on cooling through several working groups, including the urban heat adaptation, nature for cooling, and passive cooling. The UN Secretary General call to action has placed really a great task before us. And I'm confident that having all the tools in front of us, we can succeed if we work together. We have the knowledge and the tools to succeed. So I'm very much looking forward for the discussion today to discuss what are the best practices and what are the remaining challenges and how we can work together to address them. Thank you so much, and back to you, Eli.
Thank you so much, Gulnara, for setting the scene for us. I will now turn it over to my colleagues from WRI, Ruth Engel and Saif Shabu, who will be giving a technical presentation on the role of data in mitigating extreme heat in cities.
Thank you, Eily. So I'm Ruth Engel, and with my colleague Saif Shabu, we are going to speak for a few minutes on how we are using different kinds of geospatial data to understand urban heat hazards and to plan for practical interventions in cities. Next slide, please. As we have just established, and I think everyone on this call knows, extreme heat is a growing hazard around the world, and it's also incredibly inequitably distributed. Cities are usually hotter than non-cities, but also within cities, different neighborhoods can be very different temperatures, and the way in which neighborhoods are planned and built can actually either exacerbate or mitigate heat exposure very locally for the people in those neighborhoods. And so planning our cities in a more sustainable way and also retrofitting cities to protect people is a growing project. Next slide, please. And cities around the world are taking action on this and planning for heat resilient infrastructure and heat resilient policy that can help mitigate the risk for residents in the city. In collaboration with the WRI Global Network, we are working with a number of these cities to examine ways in which locally grounded solutions are possible. Next slide, please. But there are substantial barriers to action. In particular, understanding exactly how the changes that are being made will affect people in those spaces, and then communicating that clearly is keeping people from just moving forward with locally based solutions. And although we do see substantial opportunity for really no-lose solutions in cities, it's difficult to take action without knowing exactly what that solution will look like and how it will affect local heat. Next slide, please.
So as part of user research and discovery process, we conducted more than 50 interviews with different city officials representing different departments like the urban planning, climate department, disaster management, environmental agencies, and also discussion with experts in heat resilience like chief heat officers and organizations providing existing solution for heat actions like Smart Surface Coalition, Ashok Center, and C40. So based on these interviews, we managed to understand better the local context of the cities, know better the urban heat agenda, the existing ongoing initiatives, and also identify what are the opportunities and the constraints that local data can help us for heat modeling efforts. Also, these discovery interviews help us to understand better the user needs, know our users, the city officials that might use heat data and heat tools, and identify their journey in planning heat adaptation projects, and involve them as soon as possible in co-designing data and tools that help them to address effectively urban heat adaptation projects. So we learned from this discovery process that heat metrics, there is a need for better clarity of what are the heat metrics to use for a specific scale of analysis and specific expected outcomes. And the majority of city officials, they are interested to consider in this heat metrics how people are really experiencing the heat and consider the health dimension and the thermal comfort estimation. So this requires access to hyperlocal heat data and modeling, and access also to centralized data platform connecting different aspects of the heat shading, urban heat especially, shade infrastructure, surface characteristics, urban features, urban tree canopy. And also this data platform can help to break the data silos between different departments involved in the urban decision making, like the climate and the health and the urban planning departments. Two use cases have been highlighted by the city officials to address urban heat and help them to develop tools to effectively plan their heat actions. They want to know how to prioritize area for planning effectively cooling infrastructure, overlaying different dimensions that can be considered, and also to be able to build different scenarios for simulating the cooling benefit of different urban interventions that they can implement in their cities. This input drove our research roadmap and our heat modeling approaches. Next slide, please.
So one of the ways in which we're looking at heat specifically within cities is modeling hyperlocal heat exposure and using a variety of characteristics about the city, 3D elevation and models of buildings and trees and other urban features, land use and land cover and surfaces, and then different aspects of meteorology to really understand the individual thermal burden of people outdoors moving through a city. Next slide, please. And so this can actually give us really detailed data about the heat infrastructure of a city. And the data sets being shown here are from Cape Town's Central Business District. Cape Town has been an amazing partner in this work and has really interesting and detailed data about both infrastructure and heat within the city. And the Central Business District is one of the hottest parts of the city, and it's also one of the places where people are moving through the space day to day as they go to work. So on the left here, we can see land use and land cover from a WRI data set developed in partnership with the Smart Surfaces Coalition that shows that this neighborhood is fairly impervious and that there's a lot of paved space, a lot of big buildings, and not a huge amount of distributed green space that can provide resources for people who need to take a break from the heat. On the right, we can also see shade coverage, and this is actually combined shade here from buildings and trees, though we can separate that data out. And you can see in the chart that tree cover shade is a very small part of overall shade and a small part of the overall neighborhood resources within this area. And when there is substantial shade, like at 6 p.m., that shade is mostly coming from tall buildings casting long shadows. So there is some shade resources later in the day, but during the hottest parts of the day, that kind of mid to late afternoon time, there is not very much shade resource for anybody outdoors. Next slide, please. One of the things that we can do with this data is connect it directly to heat exposure. So here we're looking at 3 p.m. At the Universal Thermal Comfort Index, which is actually a composite index of a lot of different heat sources on the body. So it's kind of the combined effect of heat that you, a person, might feel outdoors in this space. And you can really see the distribution of heat throughout the neighborhood and the areas where there's kind of big open spaces or on the roofs of buildings where the sun is hitting very directly, and then the areas where there is some shade. And you can also see that areas that are grassy, like this bottom left corner of the map, for instance, show a little bit cooler. So we can see the impact of parks, for example. And then on the right here, we can actually track heat over the course of the day. So as we look across the afternoon, we can see that all three of these solid lines on this graph are much hotter than the dotted lines. And the solid lines are unshaded areas and the dotted lines are shaded areas. So we can really see the substantial difference that shade makes in protecting people from heat. And that if you can find some shade, you can really cool yourself down by a pretty big margin. But then independent of that, we can also see the effect of land use. And the fact that green spaces tend to be cooler than spaces that are not green, but also that each land use area has a distinct curve of how it absorbs and re-releases heat over the course of an afternoon. So we can really kind of drill down to a very local level to understand what it means to stand in a space. And then we can translate that back to urban features. So here we've, the chart in the bottom, we have actually split out park areas and non-park areas, and then looked at what it means to be in a park and shaded versus not in a park and shaded, and what kinds of resources different urban features like parks or like building shade can provide to people in space. Next slide, please. And from there, we can actually project out what it would mean to implement different changes to the city that are being planned to protect people. So we are running scenarios that look at a number of different things, like tree planting, like cool rooftops, like the increase in shade infrastructure in cities, and potentially the planning of new specific parks in conjunction with cities that are actually looking to implement these changes. So here we're showing a scenario for increasing street tree coverage in the neighborhood. And we have actually designed a program that will identify plantable area for street trees. So, kind of legally plantable area for trees along the street. And then we have planted a bunch of trees throughout the neighborhood in the model. And these trees are realistic, both in terms of how they're spaced out around the neighborhood, and then also in terms of the distribution of tree height and tree canopy for the city of Cape Town. So they're derived from the actual existing data. They are not real trees, but they are potentially real trees. And we actually can model then the changes to shade and the changes to heat that could come from those trees. So in the middle here, we've singled out a street where we've planted a bunch of trees to create a cool corridor within the neighborhood. And you can see the changes from left to right that come with the actual tree planting. And then on the right here, we can see the cooling potential, again, in the Universal Thermal Comfort Index. So the actual burden on the body of a pedestrian that would come from tree planting. So you can see that the street itself is much cooler with the addition of trees. And a lot of that comes from shade, but also from the greenness of trees. And so we can understand how these scenarios would affect heat within a city. Next slide, please.
So we are actively developing a data platform to host the different data set and the different maps that my colleague Ruth shared with you in this previous slides. And this data platform will allow city officials to explore interactively the different maps and data set that we are producing at the city level and also at their neighborhood levels based on specific area of interest, and also to explore the outputs of the scenario that we are co-building with them to estimate the cooling potential and cooling impact of specific urban intervention that they want to implement in their cities. Now we are conducting in this period different user testing sessions to collect feedback from potential users and potential city officials in order to drive the roadmap of the feature that we should include in our data platform, and also the data set that should include and make them available. Next slide, please. So please feel free to connect with us to schedule a demo or for a user testing session if you want to learn more about the data platform that we are developing and the data set that we are generating. And if you think that your city might benefit from such data platform, it would be great to explore any potential application of our heat modeling in your cities. Thank you for your attention. We will share with you the link to schedule directly a demo of our data team, or you can contact us directly based on the email that are shared in the slide. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth and Saeed, for that incredible presentation. I am seeing quite a few questions come up in the Q&A. So everybody who's asked a question, our team will work on answering those now that the technical presentation is concluded. And if we can move on to the next slide, please. I will introduce my colleague from WRI, John Rob Poole, who will be leading an in-depth panel with a couple of representatives from cities who will be talking about their own strategies for mitigating urban heat. Thanks, John Rob.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Ailey. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to virtually see so many of you on this webinar, Extreme Urban Heat, Opportunities to Mitigate Risks in Cities. My name is John Rob Poole, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's panel discussion, where we're going to be learning from two cities that are trailblazing the way on tackling extreme heat. We have two stellar panelists, and they're actively leading the way themselves and with their teams and their cities on tackling urban extreme heat. So without further ado, let me invite them to join me on the virtual stage here. First up, Esteban Jaramillo, the Natural Resources Deputy Secretary from the city of Medellin in Colombia. Welcome, Esteban. Thanks for joining us. And let me call on Candice Lee Arensa, a professional officer in climate change planning, risk and resilience from the city of Cape Town in South Africa. Welcome, Candice. Thanks for joining us. Colleagues, you might see on the screen that we had a third panelist lined up, but we had a last-minute cancellation due to unforeseen circumstances from our colleague Eugenia Cargbo, the Chief Heat Officer from Freetown in Sierra Leone. So we'll miss Eugenia this time, but in her absence, I encourage each of you to look into Freetown's market shading project to learn more about the city's efforts and success to reduce extreme urban heat for market women, the city's colloquial term for Freetown's female market vendors. It's a really cool project, so I encourage you to check it out. Esteban and Candice, thank you so much for joining us on this webinar and taking the time to share the lessons from your cities so that others listening in can learn and take inspiration from your lead. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Esteban, let me pose the first question to you. Medellin is particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, be it increasing heat, flooding, or other climate risks. So please tell us about how extreme heat in Medellin disproportionately affects women, the elderly, and other vulnerable communities in particular.
Good morning, John, and thanks for considering Medellin in this conversation. We are honored to share this panel with you. So Medellin, as a city in the middle of the Andes, is surrounded by mountains. The urban border is especially exposed to this risk. And in this, precisely in this urban border, live the most vulnerable communities, mothers which carries the care of load, and mothers that spend more time in home, elderly people, children, and so far vulnerable communities who are exposed to risks such as rain collapses, flooding, fires, or extreme heat. So therefore, we're a city that suffers the climate crisis in a more exposed approach because of the conformation of the terrain here. So that is why we're focusing our efforts in these specific areas in the urban borders.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Esteban. Yes, extreme heat, it seems to be a phenomenon that disproportionately affects women and other vulnerable communities and cities around the world. And it sounds like it's no different in Medellin. Looking forward to hearing a little bit more later. Candice, let me come to you now, please. I understand that Cape Town is in the early stages of developing a heat program to manage extreme urban heat in the city, and that data plays a central role in your planning. So please tell us more about heat risks in Cape Town, what the data tell you, where and how heat manifests the most, and the scenarios and strategies that Cape Town is exploring to tackle this issue. Over to you.
Thanks, John Rob. Thank you. So our data has shown us that heat island intensity in Cape Town is dependent on a number of factors, including land cover type, solar radiation levels, and wind speed and wind direction. This means that there's an unequal distribution of heat risk throughout the city that are compounded in dense urban areas like low-income communities and informal settlements, and mainly because these areas lack tree canopy cover and green spaces. We've also seen that industrial activities create pockets of trapped hot air over the adjacent formal and informal residential areas, and this increases heat for those communities if the residential areas is already dense and lacking green space. Heat intensity is also high in our business districts. For example, the Cape Town CBD area experienced a 44-degree Celsius day in January this year, and this is currently the highest temperature we have on record for the CBD. In addition to these, the city's urban form, our data has also shown us that the city has a natural temperature variability due to topographic features and certain climatic factors. This means that there are certain areas in the city that are naturally hotter, and they tend to experience heat waves or high heat days in isolation from the rest of the city. So what we've done to address heat risk in Cape Town is to develop a heat action plan that was approved late last year. The plan has 12 actions that's categorized into 3 main components, which are heat readiness, heat response, and knowledge management and research. So heat readiness aims to ensure effective preparation and planning to reduce the risk of heat events impacting the city's business continuity and service delivery, specifically in areas already experiencing challenges with service delivery, and specific city functions that focuses on vulnerable groups. Each response focuses on putting in place processes and interventions to respond to and manage the various impacts of heat risk to the public shortly before and during a heat event. And then the knowledge management and research includes having access to good quality data and data analysis. And this component should inform the first 2 components, heat response and heat readiness. It should inform decision-making, planning, and help enable effective monitoring and evaluation. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Candice. Thanks for contextualizing that there are so many different interacting factors that influences how heat risks manifest in cities. And great to hear a little bit about Cape Town's action plan already. I know you'll speak more to it in the next question. Esteban, let me come back to you, please. I want to focus on Medellin's Green Corridors program. It's really well known, it's really well respected. It's internationally recognized as an outstanding example of how urban trees and green spaces can help reduce local temperatures. Can you tell us about the heat issues that Medellin was struggling with before the project, and the interventions that you prioritized, and the specific heat reduction benefits that you've achieved, please?
Thanks, Jamie. So back in 2015, we started the work of green corridors. We prioritized 36 green corridors and developed them as a part of a strategy to tackle back 5 problems we were facing. The first one, we looked to increase ecological connectivity as an important tool to protect our biodiversity. The second was to protect water, the water that runs through the city. The third one was that we were looking for more green public spaces. And finally, the pollution and of course, urban heat. So we worked on 2 ways. First, green corridors through the water courses, the rivers through the city. And we focused the work there in a green public space for people to enjoy these areas. And we also linked this work with sport, with cultural spaces, with educational spaces. The other focus we made was to reduce heat in the corridors associated with cars and public transport. Those corridors focused the interventions in the transformation of the floor, looking for a transition from hard surfaces to soft surfaces. And we also were looking for to prioritize this transition in the places of the city in which we recognize the most heavy heat temperatures. In Medellin, as a tropical city, we identified that the temperature can change almost to 10 degrees in the different time lapses of the day. This heat phenomenon affects the and affect in a most dangerous approach to elder people, children, and informal workers. So the green corridors were looking to strengthen this ecological connectivity and to reduce temperatures in different ways. Estimations we've made in Medellin has, or the evidence we have to this date has sent us to some preliminary conclusions. We have reduced temperature from 2 degrees, and we have also reports of 8 degrees in the midday, in the most intense heat hours of the day. So the evidence is telling us that a good solution that help us reducing the temperature, but also to remove pollution and to reduce noise in the city is linked to these green corridors.
Wonderful, Esteban. Thank you so much. Amazing to hear of these early anecdotal results, some of them not anecdotal, I know, actually. And also to hear of the co-benefits that Medellin has achieved through this inspirational program. Thanks for sharing. Candice, let me come back to you, please. So addressing extreme heat requires a multifaceted approach, from urban planning to community education. So Candice, can you please elaborate on Cape Town's planned or implemented projects, maybe through the Heat Action Plan, that specifically address urban heat risks felt by women and other vulnerable groups?
Yes, I will mention one example that is laying the groundwork for implementation of interventions, and another example that is currently in planning. So as part of the implementation of the action plan, we have developed a sector-based heat risk assessment template. So this tool aims to focus on key service delivery departments and those departments who also work with vulnerable groups, such as the elderly, early childhood development centers, and women and girls. And it aims to identify specific heat risks and impacts, and to also identify short, medium, and long-term interventions to respond to these risks and impacts that was identified. So in this way, we'll be able to ensure that planning projects and investments are specific and prioritized and directed for the greatest impact and with quick wins where possible. We've done a heat risk assessment for one of our clinics that is located in a heat island risk area and also in a socially vulnerable area. And we are currently also planning another assessment for our early childhood development centers. And then we are also currently developing a new heat outreach program focused on the elderly. The program will also include a focus on children as well, because in Cape Town, the grandparents are often the babysitters for these small grandkids. So it's two vulnerable groups interacting, which increases the risk factor if something happens. So the program will include making groups aware of easy and simple interventions that they can implement to keep themselves cool, and how heat can impact their health as a elderly person, and their medication. We've also developed a household level cooling guideline that we will share with the group that provides details on very simple and easy and free not tips, but interventions you can implement in the home. We're also planning to write a little song on heat because the elderly like singing along, and that's how they share the tips and the awareness raising with their friends and family. And then we're also planning to show them how to make their own cooking bag or wonder bags, because using the stove increases heat in the home, and electricity tariffs are really expensive. So people will be able to save on electricity so that they can have more electricity available for things like powering a fan during a hot day. The program will also include tree planting at old age home and handing out small products like a mini cooler bag, wide rim caps, and sunscreen. Just because people prioritize the money for things like transport and food and electricity, and that kind of hinders people to spend money on things that they feel that they don't need or they won't need for a long period of time. So a lot of our projects are still in planning phase, but the specific outreach one will be implemented during October this year. Thanks.
Wonderful, Candice. Really inspiring to hear about the breadth of things that you're doing. And I think an important flag for the attendees of this webinar, that here we're showcasing both retroactive efforts, where heat was already a problem, and we've implemented a solution to tackle it, such as the one highlighted by Esteban, and proactive ones, such as the ones that are highlighted by Candice, that include forward thinking and forward planning to avoid heat risks in the future. Thank you, Candice. Esteban, I'm coming to you, and I'm going to ask both of you to slightly reduce the length of your interventions here to keep to time. My last question for you, Esteban. Many cities around the world are trying to increase their tree cover and their tree canopy and their green cover to tackle extreme heat. So what lessons from Medellin and the Green Corridors program can you share with other cities that are earlier in their journey regarding where and how to prioritize nature-based solutions and green infrastructure?
Sure, John. So evidence is suggesting us that the best way to tackle the climate crisis effects is using precisely nature-based solutions. So here in Medellin, we are focusing our efforts in what we call el Plan de Renaturalización, the renaturalization plan for Medellin. So in order to prioritize areas for these interventions, we must first identify in which areas we can solve one of the or all of these 5 challenges: ecological connectivity, pollution reductions, flooding prevention, and more public space for people. So the first lesson for us is to use this opportunity of these interventions in order to solve as many problems as possible, which with one intervention. Another step is, or another lesson we got from this work is to strengthen a good collaborators tale in which we can link citizen to protect these areas. One particular point I want to highlight is a good thing we did was to strengthen our botanical garden as an ideal ally for researching and keeping our green corridors in good conditions. They are the ideal ally to keep getting these places better. And also, I want to highlight that in this alliance with our botanical garden, we prioritize the plantation of endemic species, endangered species, and native species in order to have a better place for local fauna. Finally, I want to highlight that we're improving or taking these interventions to other levels, such as vertical gardens or green roofs, looking to implement this nature-based solution in almost every place in the city.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Esteban. Yeah, really, really inspiring points. Thank you for sharing. Candice, I don't want to shortchange you, but we are short on time, so I ask that you respond briefly. Cape Town is one of the Data for Cool Cities 8 pilot cities, as we saw on the slides presented earlier. What role do you see international initiatives like this and others playing in helping cities to tackle extreme heat?
I feel with heat, whatever cities are preaching to the departments, stakeholders, and communities, they need to practice it and enable it in order to create real change and build resilience. But cities need to be enabled to enable others. and multidisciplinary data and tools that's made available and possible through these international initiatives play a central role in building a better understanding of the impacts, vulnerability and opportunities on the ground and at local level for cities to use. And because these initiatives use existing city-level data that's already used by departments for planning purposes, I also see these initiatives playing an important role in helping to highlight the interrelationship between heat and the city's development priorities, as well as individual department development priorities.
Wonderful, Candice.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
I'll keep it at that.
That was great. Thank you so much. I couldn't have said it better, and you said it so succinctly. Thank you. So colleagues, I'm afraid that brings us to the end of this webinar discussion. I wish we could continue with more questions, but like everything in life, all good things must come to an end. So I encourage our listeners to use the Q&A function to post your questions, and we'll do our best to provide written answers as the webinar continues. I'd like to sincerely thank Esteban and Candice for taking the time to join us today and to congratulate you on your really inspiring efforts. We look forward to continued partnership. With that, we'll conclude this panel discussion, and I'll give the floor back to my colleague Aili to introduce the next speaker. Aili, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much again for that fascinating panel. And I would like to now invite up Eleni Miravilli, who is the Global Chief Heat Officer at UN Habitat and a non-resident senior fellow at Arstrock. And she will be sharing her own reflections on this vast topic. And without further ado, we'd like to invite you on the screen. Eleni, are you there?
Yes, thank you, Ellie. Can you hear me? Hi everyone. It's great to see so many people gathered in this webinar. So I am, as a respondent to the previous two speakers, I would like to say how important it is, and I'm really glad that the focus has been both on nature-based solutions and on data-based, science-based policymaking and planning, because I think these are really, really strong and very important pillars for anything we do for building resilience in cities for heat. It's also very important always to kind of remember that we have to understand that solutions are very localized for heat. So it's great to hear from Medellin and Cape Town. However, of course, we all know, and this is why we're all here, that the challenges are enormous, and they are more or less the same for the cities on a high level. We're all dealing with very similar things because we're heating up much, much faster than we expected. We're heating up the planet much faster than we expected. So not only are cities dealing with extraordinary pressure on their critical systems, such as like transport and water and food and energy and etc., all of the basic systems that are really crucial for making a city work with these types of with this extreme heat that we're dealing with. But also the extreme heat is like a motherboard which brings a lot of other extreme weather phenomena, like drought. Like we're having extraordinary heat waves in the global north this summer that are lasting really long times with extreme temperatures. So we're also seeing a lot of drought, a lot of wildfires. I'm in Athens right now is really the fires are incredible around Athens, and it's the third day, and there's like the fire has managed to burn thousands of hectares and is going into the city, is coming into the city. And of course, also flooding, because extreme heat is also linked to increasing humidity in the atmosphere and having more intense weather, like rainfalls and more intense extreme weather events that linked to rain and winds and then flooding and land erosion. So it's all kind of linked. It's a whole series of cascading effects which we have to deal with. So let me kind of quickly say a few things on the UN and what the UN is doing about these things, and link back to Gulnara and what Gulnara started talking about. And I want to say a few things and ask you all to go and look at a few things that I will mention to get resources and to get solutions. So first of all, the call for action, for extreme heat of the Secretary General is 17 pages, and it's a great kind of overlook of where we're at and what's at stake, and what we're facing in general with extreme heat. And in the very last page are all the resources that you can find from what the different agencies, UN agencies, are doing in relation to heat. So you have from the WMO, the Meteorological Organization, the World Health Organization, UNEP, that has a lot of work on heat, ILO, the workers, the International Labor Organization, et cetera, et cetera. So take a look at that. Again, call for action, Secretary General's call for action, UN Secretary General's call for action on extreme heat. The last page, you can get an idea of what the UN is doing in general about it. Also, Gulnara talked about the Global Cooling Pledge. The Global Cooling Pledge was led by UNEP, but it has a lot of different people that have participated. The Cooling Coalition has created a pledge that more than 70 countries have actually committed to, and which is a pledge to try to figure out how to actually not go overboard with air conditioning, and actually figure out how to create more sustainable cooling. So again, take a look at the Global Cooling Pledge. There is a sub-national set of commitments for cities. So that's another kind of effort. Another big effort is CHAMP, which links to the above. And CHAMP is, and again, 70 countries have committed to it, which is to try to streamline efforts that have to do with climate planning, both designing, implementing, and financing climate plans and biodiversity plans, all the way from central government to regional to cities, so that we can start kind of having cities being better supported by other levels of government in their efforts to deal with climate change. This is called CHAMP. But more, another very important thing that I want you to keep an eye on is GEO, which is the group on Earth observation. And this is another amazing group of really important players on the Earth observation satellite kind of data providers that are creating a global heat resilience service with a lot of stakeholders. Again, GEO, G-E-O, and the Global Heat Resilience Service, it's now being cooked up. So pretty soon we're going to have some really interesting things that can help cities plan and assess and figure out and get data that are really important for creating the right kind of maps and the right kind of policies for moving forward with cities. And then I want to talk about the fact that a lot of different city networks are working together to deal with heat. So C40, Resilient Cities Network, ICLEI, the ARSROC with all the chief heat officers, the Global Covenant of Mayors are trying to start to collaborate so they can best, instead of stepping on each other's toes and competing for what they're doing in cities, actually to try to collaborate and figure out how to best support cities. So that's another positive thing. And finally, I want to say a couple of things that you can look for direct solutions to different issues that you might be looking for. And one of them is a website that is called Heat Action Platform. And if you write Heat Action Platform on Google, you will go to the site. It's the ARSROC Resilience Center that hosts it. But again, it's a lot of different cool coalition partners that worked to put it together. And it gives you ways to assess, to plan, to implement, and to evaluate heat resilience actions. So you can, it's different modules, and you can look at the modules and see what you're interested in. And then you can find examples of what cities have done or different steps that you should probably take if you want to do that. So the Heat Action Platform, really cool thing to keep in mind. There is another, I think, a very interesting resource that is particularly for heat and humid cities is Cooling Singapore, which is a lot of work has been done in Singapore. That is a really nice reference point for cities to look at how to redesign from how to redesign for nature-based solutions, but also how to redesign in relation to transportation, to energy, to the geomorphology of a city, etc., in helping with decisions and solutions for cities. And for a more Mediterranean climate, we also have the heat risk reduction guidelines, which is linked to an aqueduct. But if you write heat risk reduction guidelines, you can again get like a series of guidelines for how to use nature, water, and different materials for cooling your public spaces. And I'll finish by saying that I always, because I've worked with a lot of cities on creating heat action plans, I think that one of the first things that it is good to keep in mind to do is to map your vulnerability and exposure to cities and get the data that you need to figure out where are your populations that are most in need for immediate initiatives. And then I think initiatives and actions in three big buckets. One is awareness raising. Still a lot of people do not realize how dangerous heat is for their health. Preparedness and redesign. Preparedness is all of the small actions that we can do to make sure that we can protect people during heat waves. So this is like, from your cooling stations, hotlines, whatever you might put into effect, early warning systems that target specific groups, all the way to small insurance tools that can give workers some funding and some support so that they don't have to risk their lives or livelihoods when it's extremely hot. And then finally, the big thing, which is redesigning our cities, which is like all the ways that we have to make our cities cooler so that they're more livable and more beautiful for the future, which usually entails a lot of nature positive actions, blue and green infrastructure, building, readjustments and refurbishments, and also the different materials that we can use. So awareness, preparedness, and redesign are three easy ways of thinking about how to go about your heat action plans. Thank you very much. I hope these are helpful. I give back the floor to Ellie.
Hi, Eleni, thank you so much for your remarks. If we can move on to the next slide, I would now like to invite Jaya Dindar, who is the head of the cities program for WRI India, to give closing remarks. Thanks, Jaya.
Thank you very much, Ellie. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Fantastic. All right. So just to summarize, I mean, first of all, it was very good to hear about the data platforms that are out there from my colleagues at WRI. Also to hear from Esteban about sort of the Green Corridors initiative afoot in Medellin and how that has kind of yielded benefits towards cooling and thermal comfort. From Candice about sort of raising awareness in very interesting ways, usually using cultural and social sort of entry points, which was very interesting. And from Eleni, and Eleni just covered it all pretty much on a very positive note to talk about the efforts which are afoot towards sort of better solutioning in terms of policies, plannings, and organizations which are doing efforts on their parts. I would just take a few minutes to spotlight the case of India, especially because that has been in this, that has been in the middle of the heat storm this year specifically, and there have been many dire consequences. So just to say that, this year India experienced unprecedented heat waves, which killed hundreds of people, and not to mention the health and productivity losses. And in fact, WRI India analytics showed that just in the first 15 days of April, which is typically spring or the beginning of summer, 80% of the entire population, of the entire 1.4 billion population, suffered strong to very strong heat stress. In some parts of North India, we saw temperatures of around 50 degrees Celsius, a temperature which is beyond human endurance. But however, a little bit of a downer last month was that the government announced that there is currently no plan to classify heat as a notified disaster, which makes it eligible for financial assistance under the Disaster Management Act. And that was actually not very good. So heat, basically, unlike precipitation in the context of India, as in many other Asian countries, is not monitored very well. And there are a number of steps that the government is taking to minimize sort of loss to life and property after this year's heat wave, but they have been sort of limited to, heat index forecast, early warning systems, heat action plans, which actually over 23 of India's 30 states are taking up, and issuing advisories. However, these have been a little ineffective because, and especially for protecting vulnerable groups, because for the informal workers, they're not binding, they're not localized enough, and they don't have the necessary regulatory backup. And this is especially of concern in a country like India, where over 80% of the workforce is engaged in the informal sector, which means they're performing outdoor jobs that often demand physically demanding tasks like in construction or brick kilns and other similar fields. And not only this, a lot of these people live in informal settlements, which is more than half of India's urban population, and which is typically 5 to 6 degrees warmer than surrounding areas which have better green cover, etc. So this is not unique to India. Zooming out, by 2050, heat waves are forecast to account for nearly 1.6 million deaths, and mostly in highest-risk areas like Southeast Asia. And these regions may see their heat exposure going up 12 to 38 times, with the growing urbanization as a contributing factor. So just think about that. If it's bad now, what that's going to look like. Climate change is one aspect of this, but in urban areas, there are other contributory factors to urban heat islands, which exacerbate just heat in general, like built materials, lack of vegetation, and waste heat, which is coming from tailpipe emissions, exhaust from AC, industrial activities, etc. So the bottom line is that we cannot air condition our way out of this problem. And there are short and long-term solutions, which different agencies, different stakeholders are trying out. Short-term, looking at, starting by measuring, because you can't manage what you can't measure. And that is the first step to making the problems and its impacts visible. So that's one thing that is being, done by several organizations. Propagating for shade and cooling shelters with sort of access to hydration and first aid as the first sort of responders. Green infrastructure, sponge and pervious surfaces. There's a whole, movement going on across the world. It's called depaving, where people are looking at making their surfaces permeable, digging out surfaces which are very heavily concretized. It's interesting. There's also the concept of cool pavements and the kind of technologies that you can use to do all of that. And then there's the whole point about awareness and education, because that's a big part of it. How do you capacitate communities and stakeholders to better understand heat waves and to take data-driven vulnerability assessments? So, and the long-term solutions, of course, localized heat action plans, urban planning and design prerogatives, especially looking at passive cooling measures. Sustainable mobility, because a lot of the transport emissions are causing increased sort of heat islands in urban areas. Better waste management, landfill management, which is not done properly in most cases. And methane, of course, has much higher heat content than any other gas. And then, developing the human and financial capacity at the end of it all to take a systems approach to urban heat management. Now, WRI India is working on resilience, on heat resilience through our cities, water and energy programs. So we're focusing on data and evidence, so building baselines, climate hazard vulnerability assessment, looking at heat islands, who is impacted where, basically making the problem and its impacts visible, taking plans like the climate action plans to projects, looking at creating investable pipelines of nature-based solutions, for example, and how do you scale those? And then looking at improving financing for climate adaptation and resilience. So looking at contextualized business models and blended finance options that we can take up. So just to end, I'll say that, heat is a silent killer and does not receive adequate political salience like it should. A lot of the impacts, unless mortality is directly related to heat or heat stroke or heat stress, is not even recorded in many places. And it has serious implications, not just on humans, but on other biodiversity, on food and water security. But the challenges are not insurmountable. And I would also like to end on a positive note that we do have the ability to implement a lot of these short and long-term actions. And this is especially important and deserves sort of deep thought on our part for its equity implications. So we have a choice. And I think the last word would be, let's choose to build with nature, build resilience and better adaptive capacities, especially for most vulnerable. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that uplifting final sentiment, Jaya, and for the comprehensive reflections. If we can move on to the next slide, I was seeing a lot of interest in the chat, and also just to reiterate what Jaya just said, we do have a choice to build with nature, to build inclusively, to build with our community's needs in mind. And the foundational step of building is understanding, and Urban Shift recognizing that. Within the past year, we have released a free resource to really deepen everybody's knowledge on a lot of these key approaches to urban heat, from nature-based solutions to building green neighborhoods, to taking an integrated approach to urban planning and climate action. I know we are short on time, but these courses are free. They're a really excellent starting point for a lot of the questions that came up around how you can integrate nature-based solutions in the midst of rapid urban development, how you can retrofit very concrete absorptive surfaces with nature, with greenery. They're really great resources, and we encourage you all to scan the QR codes. We'll also share the link in the chat so you can enroll in these courses and begin your learning journey or strengthen it if you're already on it. And to wrap up, let's move to the next slide. We will leave it here. Thank you all for staying with us, but I know that there were so many questions in the chat that we have not yet gotten to. The contacts on this slide, Ruth, Saif, John Rob, and myself, we are all happy to take questions following the webinar, connect you with resources, anything to help. We're so grateful that you were all able to join us today. Please reach out, and thank you so much for taking action and for participating in this conversation. Thank you, everyone.